Great, thanks everybody. Let me know if you can't hear me and I will grab the mic, but I'll do my best to project. So my name's Justin. I've been with Sophos for 12 years. I want to talk a little bit about the threat landscape and how that has changed a little bit over that time. And more specifically, what's happening the last year and a half that is really kind of drastic. So I can remember when this number was at about 50,000, but now we're seeing almost 500,000 malicious files every single day. What we focus on is security and keeping up with this kind of battle. It's tough from a traditional AV perspective, but that's one of the reasons that we've come out with some next-gen protection over the last year or so. What's really interesting when you look at that number, that 500,000 files per day, 75% of malicious files only ever land at one company. So if you get infected with something, your neighbor across the street is getting a completely different variant of that. Now, what that has kind of led to, and this is what is so tough from a traditional AV perspective to keep up with, is this staggering exponential growth that you can see here. So, we think back, 10 years and we're talking 50,000 per day, now at 400,000 per day. The interesting fact here is that out of all the malware that we have ever seen from the 80s to today, more than a quarter of that has come out in just the last 12 months. So that exponential growth does not show any signs of stopping. A lot of that has to do with polymorphism. So when you go to a malicious link, you're going to get a completely different file than the next person that goes to that exact same link. The malware is changing itself every time it gets downloaded. So how do we stay ahead of that curve of threats? Well, we have to kind of understand how those threats have evolved. And depending on how long you've been in IT, you may remember quite a few of these names. Starting with Melissa and Love Letter. But really the big turning point was the Zeus Trojan. And that's where the malware writers really started to make some money. And around 2009, we saw the introduction of crimeware as a service. So now you get things like remote access Trojans, ransomware, and one specific family of that made over $1 billion back in 2016, the Locky ransomware. So it's a big moneymaker for malware writers to the tunes of billions of dollars a year. I mean, $1 billion for just one particular family of malware. But when you look at the damages as well, too, it's not just the immediate gain in money that's made from paying off the ransom, but the damages that are done from having to go to backups and restore and recover data or losing out on productivity because of that. Now, Sophos has a cloud-managed dashboard, but the malware writers have one too, and that's what we're looking at right here. This is a cloud-managed dashboard for the Black Hole Exploit Kit. Now this one's a little outdated, but there's some interesting technology behind the scenes. So when you, if you have a couple $100, you could be a malware writer yourself. And that payload, rather than throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks, is going to be much smarter about it. Because it can actually query the machine and say, well, what operating system is it? What browser do you have installed? Do you have Java? Do you have Adobe? And what are you vulnerable to based on the versions that you're reporting? So malware has gotten a lot smarter in the last couple of years. And again, staying ahead of that is, requires kind of a change in direction. Now, I use Mac, Linux, and Windows at home. But like I said, I've been at Sophos for 12 years, and I have heard this so many times, and I shake my head every time. I usually do a lot of phone calls, which is good, because then I'm not, saying that I blatantly disagree with you, but really, if you're not using Windows, you're not the low-hanging fruit, but it doesn't mean that you're safe. So I apologize. This is a bit of an eye chart. Absolutely, you can't make out any dates here at the back of the room, but this is May 2016 to January 2017. And this is just one particular variant of one particular piece of Linux-based malware. So again, you're not the lowest hanging fruit if you're running Linux, but this particular remote access tool could get in through a brute force SSH attack. And once you're in there, now you can infect the file server, the web server, whatever Linux is providing to a network. So protecting Linux is just as important, as is protecting Android. This is another big avenue for malware writers. Is there anybody in the room that does not have their work email on their phone? I probably could have asked the other way around, and we would have seen every hand go up. People have, whether it's their own personal business, small businesses, enterprises, doing business on the phone, doing it mobile, that's just the nature of the business. And as a result of that, the more information we have on our phones, the better target that is for malware writers. So we have seen a tremendous uptick in the amount of malware as well too. You can actually see the total number of APKs, so Android packages in dark blue, and then the amount of malware in light blue. And it's about half. So chances are if you grab a random app for Android, there's a 50% chance that it might be malware. Macs, I'm a big Mac fan myself, but that has all the same problems that the Windows platforms do as well. And a real big name was the transmission client. So if anyone's familiar with that, it's a BitTorrent client, but basically they hacked into that company's servers and were able to infect their actual application. So if you're using something like a built-in protection in the Mac, like a gatekeeper, which only lets you install from trusted developers, this was a trusted developer, and they were hacked into. The malware was put into their application, and you could have all the right safety mechanisms in place in the operating system and still install that malware. Now, it'd be fantastic if everyone could push out patches and prevent vulnerabilities. That's a big step towards protecting your environment. Realistically, though, when we look at things in the real world, we can't push those patches out day one. Sometimes, all the machines aren't on the network, or there might be a conflict or a compatibility issue with something else that's out there. So the concept of Patch Tuesday unfortunately leads to this idea of Exploit Wednesday. As soon as there is information out there that machines might be potentially vulnerable or applications might be vulnerable, there are malware writers that are working to exploit those problems and try and get onto networks. Now again, how does this, how do we kind of shift our focus from the way that we were doing things years ago and kind of, target things in a different way? Well, we've got to understand, the malware is more advanced. Adversaries are active, so they're actively trying to get into your networks. They're not, again, throwing it at the wall to see what sticks. There's a more targeted approach nowadays, and they're banking on companies not having visibility into the incidents that are happening out there, hoping they can slip something small into the network and then gain a foothold and expand from there. Now, so the industries that are most at risk for kind of targeted attacks, it's kind of a no-brainer, but they want to get at the PII just as much as they want to get at intellectual property. Now, if your industry is not up here, it doesn't mean certainly that you're free from malware, and I'm sure you know that, but there's a lot of valuable information in the financial, healthcare sectors, government, transportation. This was from smallbiz.com, and basically they surveyed a number of users and how many of them responded with the fact that they had been a victim of a cyber attack or the victim of a data breach. And I mean, we're talking 50% across the board, and this is small businesses. It's the same problem that enterprises face as well. Now, what's really interesting to me is I think everybody kind of put their hands up and they're concerned about ransomware, right? But the interesting thing is that all these different attacks that happen to companies, ransomware is a very small percentage of all these other incidents that happen. Now, how that ransomware gets onto the network is often from those things that are higher up in the stack. There are problems with web-based attacks. People are falling for phishing and social engineering attacks. So even though ransomware is a pretty small percentage of what's impacting companies, it's incredibly damaging, it's incredibly counterproductive. It means that you have to re-image machines or go to backups. And then this is our other problem too, right? We can stand up the best security that you can imagine, best of breed all across the board, and in this corner we have Dave. Users are going to do stupid stuff with the data. You give them access to systems, they're going to open emails, they're going to click on links. And unfortunately, this is kind of what we have to take into effect. So, and how do we combat these problems? So, if we look at it from this way, there's an interesting kind of pyramid how we can narrow our focus here. So, we talked about those 400,000 threats per day that we're seeing. That's every single day. Now, from a traditional AV perspective, we're releasing about 10 definitions every day of the year, all year long. You could stop 9 out of 10 data breaches by just preventing the exploits. So again, that concept of low-hanging fruit, if you're patching, you're in better shape. The problem is there are about 6,800 vulnerabilities per year. So a lot of people think Windows patches, operating system patches, but of course you have to patch all the different applications, Office, Adobe, and so on. And sometimes there are applications out there that you don't know that the users have installed. So how do we prevent all these things? Well, we can do it by targeting the exploit methods themselves. So what we've done with what's called Sophos Intercept is to basically look at the exploit methodologies themselves. It's a signatureless scanner, and it can run side-by-side AV. And basically what's happening is that instead of looking at the files, we're looking at the behaviors. We're looking to see if this is something that is behaving like an exploit or a vulnerability. You can see some of the more traditional vendors towards the middle here, and then some of the next-gen vendors on the right. These are 24 different exploit methodologies that we're looking at from that exploit mitigation engine. There's some green dots there, especially on the next-gen vendors. They are looking at some of the stuff out there, but there's a lot of white space on these charts. And really, we've taken what we've learned by analyzing those 400,000 files that we see come through the labs every day and narrowed that focus down to a small subset of the most common exploits that occur. Intercept is, again, it's a signatureless-based approach. And what we're doing here is basically 4 key components. So this is all basically what's happening here. You can see the exploit mitigation engine. Again, it's looking at 24 different types of exploits. Now, what's interesting there is that, if we, from a traditional AV perspective, trying to keep up with those 400,000 files per day, actually, let me jump back. To do that from an AV and a definition-based perspective, again, we're talking about 10 definitions every day of the year, all year long, versus targeting things from an exploit methodology, we're talking about tens of updates across the entire year. Because the techniques don't change that much. Now, I've been at Sophos 12 years. I've been doing computer security for about 17 years. And one of the first things I learned was how to hack into systems to then protect against those attacks. And buffer overflows were a thing then. They're still a thing now. You're targeting different applications. You're targeting different pieces of memory, but the techniques don't change nearly as frequently as those 500,000 files do every single day. So by focusing in on those specific techniques and the sub-techniques around those, that's what allows us to do better 0-day and 0-minute protection. A couple big names in the news recently, WannaCry, Petya v2, not Petya. I'm sure some of you have heard of those, hopefully not been impacted by them. But our AV engine, just like any other vendor, it's a reactionary thing, right? We see it, we issue a definition, you get that definition, you're protected against it. That's how every AV vendor works. What's different with Intercept is that because the behaviors don't change behind the scenes, even though there's that brand new threat that's out there, WannaCry we were catching at minute 0, no updates required. Because it behaves the same way, it uses the same hooks to get into the operating system. So there's the exploit mitigation engine. There's a new cleanup engine that runs behind the scenes as well too. Because we're tracking all the behaviors, we're tracking the file touches, what files are read, written, processes that are spawned, created, all these different things, that's all part of our cleanup process. So where traditional AV will clean up that file, we can clean up all the different things that were happening behind the scenes when it finally exhibited that exploit behavior. Now this is another big part of it as well too, CryptoGuard. What CryptoGuard is basically, it's your kind of last line of defense. So if a malware writer was to put something together, simple script, doesn't have to be a piece of malware that's out in the wild. This is a script that uses something like 7-zip or WinRAR, and it encrypts and archives files, but instead of giving you the key, it ships off the key to that malware writer. There's nothing that's necessarily malware about that, right? It's just a script that's doing a pretty simple function on a network. It didn't have to use an exploit either. So if I can convince somebody to run that file and they have rights to read the data and run a simple script, it doesn't have to use an exploit to get there. But what CryptoGuard does is it's actually looking at any documents that are opened by the user or by the system, and it makes a real-time backup of those in our own encrypted space. And now this isn't anything that you need to free up a ton of disk space for. It happens locally on the box, and as new files come in, old files go out. But when those new files come in and they get encrypted, and that looks very different programmatically from when we make normal file modifications, what we can do is we can kill off the process that's doing that encryption and roll back the damage to the files. Now, when you combine that with what we call root cause analysis, and I think I have a slide on that, good. This is one of my favorite pieces of InterceptX, because when you look at traditional AV logging, it tells you, and it better tell you, the what, where, and when. So what was the threat? Where did it happen? User, computer, file, and what date and time? I don't think that's asking too much. Any product should be able to do that. But the big thing here, and I apologize, it's a little tough to make out, but it's the how. So root cause analysis tells us how did that get onto the machine. So now when we look at this chain of events, and I apologize, I'm going to step in here and provide my silhouette to the screen here. You can see the root cause with the dot in red here. The beacon event is the blue dot over here. And what that's telling us is this is all regular, normal activity that the end user is doing. They're browsing in Outlook. Maybe they opened up an Adobe document, and that Adobe document had a link in it, and that spawned Chrome. Traditional AV is only going to tell you that, hey, we found this virus way over here. But what InterceptX and root cause analysis will tell you is what actually happened to get to that point. So we can very easily see the files in light blue, the registries in dark blue, the processes in green, the network connections in yellow. And if I click on any of those, you can actually bring up details about what network connections, what processes were involved. And that is a huge piece that you can go back with, because it's not just catching the threat, but it's telling you, again, how did it happen? How did we get to that point? So now I can go back and I say, well, do I need to tighten my email rules up? Do I need to tighten my web rules up? If it's the same person again and again that's clicking on that file, do I need to educate that user, restrict their application usage? So this is a huge piece that you can use to, again, not just know that you're catching it, but know how to prevent that type of incident from happening in the future. So some takeaways, I mean, if you can deploy patches quick, that's great, but again, it may be tough to kind of understand what applications are out there if you're not doing any kind of application inventory. But any applications that you can limit, any web usage you can limit, it's safer. It's not always the easiest thing to do. One thing that I wish I saw more often in the industry is run as a non-privileged user. So if you're a network admin, make yourself a regular account and log in with that 9 times out of 10 unless you need to do something. Increasing employee awareness is a big thing, and kind of understanding where they're making those mistakes with root cause analysis is one way that you can come back and kind of make decisions about what do we need to educate users on. Are they clicking on links? Are they opening up, suspicious documents that do get through the email? But anything that we can do ultimately at the end of the day to reduce the attack surface, and we can help out in a lot of ways on that front. From the endpoint perspective, we can control applications, web, devices, and of course provide a full antivirus suite that's both available on-premise, and specifically what we've been talking about is our cloud-based offering called Sophos Central. But in a nutshell, that's kind of the landscape of where we're at today, kind of how that has changed in the last couple of years. But really the more you can do to kind of understand how those threats, how those exploits are happening, and you can go back and kind of backtrack and understand how to prevent that stuff in the future is a huge help. I think I've got like 60 seconds left if there are any questions. If not, I won't be offended. If you have questions that come up later, Steve, you want to throw your hand up real quick? Yeah. Steve can answer because I've actually got to get out of here at the end of the event. So Steve can help out with the really technical stuff. He loves the technical questions. 50-50. Yeah, great. All right, thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you, Justin.